I want to welcome you to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Vayishlach. And to get a sense of where we are in the narrative of Jacob and Esau, if we remember, Jacob had to flee from his home after he tricked his father Isaac into giving him the blessing that Isaac had wanted to give to Esau. So Esau threatened to kill Jacob, and he left, and he went back to the old family homestead in Haran, where he met Rachel, and he ends up working for Laban for 20 years, and he marries both Leah and Rachel, and of course Leah has 6 of the sons who become the tribes of Israel, and then there are 2 maidservants. Each one of them has 2 sons, and then Rachel finally also has a son, Joseph. And if it is at this point that then Jacob decides to leave Haran, leave Laban, and to go back to the land of Israel, where, of course, he's going to meet up again with his brother Esau. And that's where we are. But we have in this week's Torah portion what I personally think is perhaps the most important passage in the story, in the narratives of the patriarchs. You know, we've been talking over the last several Shabbases on a theme about the fact that the patriarchs are not models for us because they were perfect human beings. They were not great people because they were born great people. They're models for us because they became great people, because they had to overcome shortcomings in their personal character. They had to overcome their baser impulses. And we've spoken about the fact that Abraham, at least according to the Ramban, to Nachmanides, sinned when he decided to leave the land of Israel to go down to Egypt because of a famine. And when he told his wife Sarah that she should say that she is his sister rather than his wife. And so we see that the fact is that Abraham himself was not a perfect person, but he sinned. He had to overcome things in his character. Certainly when we get to Jacob, we're dealing with a character who has some major problems. I mean, the stories that we've read about Jacob, that he forced his brother Esau to sell him his birthright, his right as being the firstborn, in order to get some soup. You know, Esau comes in from the field. He says, "I'm dying of hunger." Jacob says, "I'll give you some food. First sell me your birthright." You say, that's the patriarch of the Jewish people? That's what it means to be a Jew? And then, of course, the very, very dramatic and poignant story of how Jacob pretends to be Esau. And he takes advantage of the fact that his father Isaac is blind. And he tricks him into giving him his blessing rather than giving it to Esau, which had been his intention. And as a result of that, Jacob had to flee. And it's a very strong point, by the way, that when Jacob goes up to Haran and he first meets Rachel and falls in love with her and agrees to work for Laban for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. And then Laban, who of course is really the master trickster of them all, he switches the 2 daughters and gives Jacob Leah instead of Rachel. So in the morning, when Jacob discovers that this switch had taken place, he goes to Laban. He says, what's going on here? He says, look, here we don't switch the younger one for the older one. So Laban really gives Jacob a little bit of a stab in the stomach, I would say, but he points out to him his own offense. You put yourself, the younger son, in place of the older one. We don't do that here. Therefore, you have to marry Leah before you can marry Rachel. So that story, I think, shows us that indeed Jacob was guilty of this offense. Meanwhile, in today's Torah portion, we finally come to what I think is the great metaphor, the great image, and that is a wrestling match. Jacob is left on the side of the river by himself, and that night a man wrestles with him. Now, this is part of the intrigue and the interest of this narrative. It's never made quite clear who is this figure that Jacob wrestles with. He's called a man, and yet it seems that he's not just a man. And according to the Midrash, this angel was actually the angel of Esau, although others say that it was the Yetzer Hara. And one could say that the angel of Esau was the Yetzer Hara. But I think the point here is that Jacob was wrestling with himself. He was wrestling with his Yetzer Hara, with his evil inclination, with his inclination, with that inclination that is in every human being that wants us to do things that we shouldn't and prevents us from doing things that we should. He was wrestling with his own nature. That, I think, is the point here. And this image of this wrestling match is so perfect. This is what it's all about. This is, I think, the image, the metaphor for life. All of life is a struggle, because all of us are born with a Yetzer Hara. All of us are born with characters that have to be shaped, that have to be molded, and we have to overcome our own shortcomings, our own desires and impulses. And so all of life is a wrestling match, a struggle. And so that's why the patriarchs, we see that they weren't born perfect people. They had to become who they became. And they did so with struggle, constant struggle and strife. And that's why this wrestling match is such a perfect image for what life is all about. And this is why I see this particular episode as being really the pinnacle of the story of the patriarchs in the Torah, because it makes very clear this whole idea that life is a struggle. Life is about constantly striving to achieve something greater, to become who we really should become. You know, there's a great Hasidic story about Reb Zusia, and Reb Zusia was sitting and crying, and his student said to him, Reb Zusia, why are you crying? And he says, because I realize that when I go to heaven after my death, they're not going to ask me, why weren't you more like Abraham? Or why weren't you more like Moses? No, they're going to ask me, why weren't you more like Zusia? Why didn't you become the person that you had the potential to become? That's the struggle. That's what life is about. And it's for all of us. You know, I'm never going to be Abraham. I'm never going to be Moses. I'm never going to be Maimonides. But you know what? The question is, can I become the best person that I have the potential to be? That's what life is about. And that's what we see in the story of the patriarchs, and indeed in many other biblical stories as well. And that's why they are models for us. They're not models before us because they were simply born perfect human beings and, oh, we can just dream about that we might also be perfect, which of course we can't. But no, they're models for us because they're models of people who struggled with themselves, struggled with their own natures, and became the great people that they became. Good Shabbos.